Ethan Harper sipped his black coffee slowly, the steam curling into the crisp morning air of the small city cafe. He watched the pedestrians hurry past the window, their faces blurred by the early sunlight, and felt an unfamiliar restlessness tug at his chest. Life had settled into a predictable rhythm: work at the design studio, occasional nights out with friends, and quiet weekends filled with books and music, but lately, he couldn't shake a sense of longing for something different, something unscripted. Across the table, Julian Parker leaned back in his chair, a grin playing on his lips as he twirled a pen between his fingers. Julian always had that effect on people, effortlessly magnetic, as though he existed entirely on his own terms. "You've got to get out more, Ethan," Julian said, his tone light but teasing. "I mean, look at you. Coffee and sketches. Don't you ever crave a little adventure?" Ethan smiled, but it was a small, constrained gesture. "I get by," he said, shrugging, though the knot of curiosity in his stomach betrayed him. He had always admired Julian's fearlessness, his willingness to dive into experiences that Ethan could only imagine from a distance. There was a certain thrill in watching Julian navigate life with such boldness, and a subtle, gnawing envy in realizing how cautious he had become. Julian leaned forward, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Remember Marcus?" he asked, eyes sparkling with mischief. "I told you about him, right? That guy I met at the gallery last month?" Ethan's interest piqued. He remembered Julian mentioning a friend from a recent art exhibit, though the details had been vague. "Yeah, the African guy you said was fun?" he asked, his tone deliberately neutral, but the word lingered between them with a charged weight. Julian laughed softly, a sound that seemed to fill the space between their tables. "Fun is an understatement. Seriously, Ethan, you should try meeting him. He's smart, charming, and, well, let's just say he knows how to leave an impression." Ethan felt a flicker of something unexpected, excitement, perhaps, or maybe apprehension. He hadn't imagined himself in situations like this, at least not so vividly. The thought of meeting someone entirely new, someone outside his familiar circles, stirred a mix of curiosity and caution. "I don't know, Julian," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, I'm not really." He hesitated, unsure how to describe the nagging urge he felt to explore this unknown. "I don't usually do things like that." Julian tilted his head, studying him. "And that's exactly why you need to. Sometimes the things we resist the most are the things that show us who we really are. Trust me, Ethan. You won't regret it." Ethan looked away, staring at the condensation on his coffee cup. The words rang in his mind, stirring memories of evenings spent wondering what it would be like to step outside the narrow boundaries he had carefully constructed. He thought of the quiet moments in his apartment, sketching late into the night, feeling that his work was polished but somehow incomplete. Julian's words were a challenge, a subtle nudge toward a world he had never dared explore. "Fine," he said finally, almost reluctantly. "Maybe I'll meet him. But just once." Julian's grin widened. "That's all I'm asking. Just meet him. No pressure, no expectations. You might be surprised at what happens." The cafe seemed to shrink around them as Ethan considered the possibilities. He imagined Marcus's presence, his accent, his laugh, the way he might carry himself with a confidence that Ethan could only guess at. There was a thrill in thinking about the unknown, a pull that tugged at his sense of control and safety. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. Julian clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture casual but deliberate, and Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. "Come on," Julian said, standing. "Let's not waste the morning. I'll set it up. You just be yourself." As they stepped out into the bright city morning, Ethan felt a strange combination of anxiety and anticipation. He followed Julian through streets that were gradually waking to the day, his thoughts swirling. He kept repeating Julian's words, trying to make sense of the excitement that coursed through him. "Sometimes the things we resist the most are the things that show us who we really are." By the time they reached the art gallery where Marcus was to be waiting, Ethan's nerves were a tangled mess. The building was sleek and modern, glass panels reflecting the sunlight in sharp angles. Julian pushed open the door, stepping inside with his usual confidence. Ethan followed, feeling the weight of his own hesitation, every step echoing his inner turmoil. They were met by a warm voice that made Ethan pause. "Julian." "And you must be Ethan," Marcus said, extending a hand. His smile was easy, his presence commanding without seeming forced. Ethan shook the hand, feeling a spark of something he couldn't name. Marcus's eyes held a quiet intensity, a depth that made Ethan's pulse quicken. Julian leaned back slightly, watching the interaction with satisfaction. "See?" he whispered. "No pressure. Just talk." Ethan nodded, trying to focus on casual conversation, but he couldn't deny the pull of Marcus's gaze, the way his charm seemed to fill the space around them. Every word Marcus spoke was laced with subtle humor and insight, and Ethan found himself laughing more freely than he had in weeks. The afternoon slipped by in a blur of conversation and easy smiles. Julian eventually drifted away to mingle with other guests, leaving Ethan and Marcus alone in a quiet corner of the gallery. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the familiar walls of his careful life cracking, letting in a sliver of unpredictability and intrigue. As the sun began to dip behind the city skyline, Ethan felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The encounter had been brief, yet it had stirred something in him, an awakening of desire, curiosity, and maybe a hint of longing he hadn't acknowledged before. He left the gallery that evening with his mind racing, heart unsettled, and a sense that his life had quietly shifted in a direction he couldn't yet name. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Julian's words echoed again, teasing and insistent, "You might be surprised at what happens." Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Marcus's smile as he walked back to his apartment that evening. The city lights reflected off wet pavement, casting fractured glimmers across the sidewalks, yet his mind was far from the streets. Each step echoed with the quiet thrill of anticipation, a hum of excitement that was entirely new and wholly unnerving. For the first time in weeks, the predictability of his routine felt suffocating, as though the air he had been breathing all along was no longer enough. By the time he unlocked his door, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a message from Julian. "So, how was your meeting?" Ethan stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. His pulse quickened. Did he tell Julian the truth? That he had enjoyed Marcus's company more than he had expected, that he had felt a strange, fluttering curiosity he hadn't dared acknowledge before. He typed carefully, keeping his words measured. "It was interesting. He's different. I liked talking to him," Julian responded almost immediately. "Different can be good. Trust me. He leaves an impression for a reason." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, reading the words over and over. He knew Julian's intention, to push him, to encourage him to step further into uncharted territory. And yet, part of him hesitated. He was no stranger to temptation, but this felt heavier somehow, more electric. The next day, Marcus suggested meeting again, this time at a quiet, minimalist cafe tucked between a bookstore and an art supply shop. Ethan agreed, telling himself it was simply conversation, harmless curiosity. Yet as he approached the cafe, he felt a knot of tension coil in his stomach, each step both a thrill and a trial. Marcus was already there when Ethan arrived, seated at a corner table with a sketchbook open in front of him. His hand moved across the page with fluid precision, the lines almost dancing under his touch. When he looked up and saw Ethan, his eyes lit with a warmth that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Ethan," Marcus said, voice low and inviting. "I'm glad you came." "Of course," Ethan replied, settling into the chair across from him. "I wanted to see more of your work." Marcus smiled, a soft curl of lips that hinted at amusement and something else, something unsaid. He flipped the sketchbook toward Ethan, revealing pages filled with intricate illustrations, cityscapes that seemed to pulse with life, abstract patterns that vibrated with color. "I find that drawing helps me understand emotions I can't always put into words," Marcus said. Ethan leaned closer, studying the sketches. There was an intensity here, a depth, that resonated in ways he hadn't anticipated. He felt drawn into Marcus's world, into the energy that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. The conversation flowed easily, dipping from art to music, fleetingly to philosophy, each exchange layered with subtle humor and a quiet intimacy. At one point, Marcus paused and looked directly at him. "I get the sense you're holding back," he said. "There's curiosity there, and maybe a little fear." Ethan laughed nervously. "Maybe. I'm not used to new experiences." "New experiences can be revealing," Marcus said, his voice almost a whisper. "They show us parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. That's not a bad thing." Ethan's mind raced. He knew Marcus was right. There was a part of him, buried under routine and habit, that wanted exactly this: unpredictability, the thrill of discovery. And yet, the voice of caution whispered reminders of boundaries, loyalty, and consequences. It was a delicate balance, a dance between curiosity and restraint. Julian's words from earlier surfaced in Ethan's mind: different can be good. He leaves an impression for a reason. He had thought of them as encouragement, but now they felt like a challenge. Marcus wasn't just interesting, he was magnetic, and every interaction seemed to pull Ethan further into uncharted territory. The cafe hummed softly with the quiet murmur of other patrons, but Ethan felt cocooned in a bubble where only he and Marcus existed. He noticed the subtle gestures, the way Marcus's hand hovered near his sketchbook, the faint tilt of his head when he listened intently, the ease with which he laughed at Ethan's jokes. Each movement sent a ripple through Ethan's thoughts, leaving him simultaneously exhilarated and uneasy. Time passed unnoticed until the late afternoon light softened through the windows, casting elongated shadows across the table. Marcus leaned back slightly, closing his sketchbook with deliberate slowness. "I've enjoyed this," he said. "More than I expected, actually." "Me too," Ethan admitted, the words tasting both forbidden and necessary. He felt exposed, as though speaking the truth had shifted something between them irreversibly. There was a pause, a charged silence that seemed to stretch long enough for Ethan's heartbeat to echo audibly in his ears. Then Marcus smiled, subtle but meaningful, and Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, a connection that bypassed words entirely. Julian's voice echoed faintly in his memory: "Sometimes the things we resist the most are the things that show us who we really are." Ethan felt the truth of it settle uncomfortably in his mind. He was resisting, yes, but the resistance itself was illuminating. He realized he had stepped closer to a part of himself he had long ignored: curiosity, desire, the willingness to explore beyond safe boundaries. Finally, Ethan stood, brushing off his jeans and taking a deep breath. "I should go," he said, though the words felt hollow against the tension thrumming in the air. Marcus stood as well, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I hope we do this again," he said. "I'd like that." Ethan nodded, a mixture of excitement and apprehension knotting in his stomach. "I think I'd like that too." Outside the cafe, the city seemed brighter, sharper, more alive. Ethan walked slowly, replaying the conversation in his mind, aware of the subtle shift in his own heart. There was a thrill in stepping toward the unknown, an unspoken promise in the lingering tension between him and Marcus. When he reached his apartment, his phone buzzed again. "Julian." "So? How did it go?" Ethan stared at the message, the words on the screen almost laughing at him. He typed back slowly: "It was more than I expected," and in that simple admission, he recognized a turning point. A door had opened, a path had been hinted at, and he knew that his life was quietly, irrevocably changing. As he set his phone down and leaned against the cool apartment wall, he felt both exhilarated and unnerved. Marcus had awakened something in him: curiosity, desire, a craving for the unknown, and there was no going back to the monotony that had defined him. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a steadying breath, and allowed himself one small, thrilling thought: "I wonder what happens next." The following days felt heavier, as if Ethan were carrying a truth he hadn't spoken aloud. He moved through his routines with deliberate care, choosing his words with Daniel, measuring his silences. Nothing outwardly changed, yet everything felt different. Awareness had settled in, and it refused to be ignored. Daniel tried in small ways. He suggested cooking dinner together, asked about Ethan's work with a gentleness that felt like an offering. Ethan responded, grateful and ashamed in equal measure. He wanted to give his full attention, to return to the intimacy that once came naturally, but his thoughts betrayed him. They drifted when he least expected, pulled toward the quiet understanding he had felt outside his marriage point one evening. As they cleaned up after dinner, Daniel finally spoke the question that had been hovering between them. Is there someone else? Daniel asked, not accusing, just searching. Ethan froze, the dish towel clenched in his hands. His mind raced through possibilities: denial, deflection, confession. None felt safe. None felt honest enough. No, Ethan said after a pause. The word was technically true, and that made it hurt more. Daniel studied his face, looking for cracks. Then what is it? Ethan swallowed. I think I forgot how to talk about what I'm missing. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that. I wish you told me sooner. So do I, Ethan replied. The conversation didn't resolve anything, but it shifted something between them. There was less distance now, replaced by a fragile honesty that felt both relieving and terrifying. That night, they slept closer than they had in weeks, though Ethan lay awake longer than Daniel, his thoughts restless. The next afternoon, Ethan encountered Lucas again. This time, there was no coincidence to blame. Lucas was sitting on the front steps of the building, headphones resting around his neck, watching the street as if waiting for nothing in particular. Hey, Lucas said, standing as Ethan approached. Hey, Ethan replied. They stood there, the space between them charged with everything neither had said. Ethan noticed the restraint in Lucas's posture, the careful way he didn't step closer. I've been meaning to say, Lucas began, then stopped, reconsidering. I don't want to make things complicated for you. Ethan's chest tightened. They already are. Lucas met his gaze steadily. Then maybe we should keep things simple. The suggestion carried weight. Simplicity meant distance. It meant letting go of something that had never fully formed but had already taken root. I think that's for the best, Ethan said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. Lucas nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. I'm glad we talked. So am I, Ethan replied, surprised to realize it was true. They parted without lingering, without promises. As Ethan walked away, he felt both loss and relief. The temptation hadn't vanished, but it had been named, and that gave him a measure of control. At home, Ethan found Daniel in the living room, flipping through a book he wasn't really reading. Ethan sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. I ran into Lucas today, Ethan said, choosing honesty while it still felt possible. Daniel looked at him, attentive but calm. And I realized I don't want to lose us because I didn't know how to speak up. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding. Neither do I. They didn't solve everything that evening. There were no declarations, no sudden return to what they had been. But there was intention, and that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Later, standing alone in the bathroom, Ethan let the shower run and listened to the steady sound of water. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how a moment of vulnerability could have led him somewhere he wasn't prepared to go. He recognized now that infidelity didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as understanding. When Ethan turned off the water and stepped out, he felt steadier than he had in weeks. Not certain, not resolved, but aware. He dried his hands, glanced at his reflection, and allowed himself a small, tired smile. Life would continue, complicated and imperfect. Temptation would not disappear simply because it had been resisted once. But Ethan knew now where the line was, and that knowledge mattered. As he left the bathroom and joined Daniel in the quiet of their shared space, Ethan understood that the story wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, shaped by choices made in moments that seemed small, but never truly were.